keynote is from John Siraut. John is a distinguished economist specialising in the wider economic and social impacts of transport, who has consulted on numerous light rail, tram and bus schemes and major infrastructure projects covering road, heavy rail, ports and airports. As a senior director at Jacobs, John is an advocate of sustainable travel and amongst his advisory roles has acted as a subject matter expert for the Department of Transport's Citizens Assembly, examining ways to decarbonise transport. John, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Graham, and good morning, everybody. So if we want to move on to our first slide, great. So what I'm going to do is to sort of set the context in terms of trends of what's happening in commuting, and in particular, what's happening in cycling and walking commuting. And we're going to be looking at the situation in the UK, in the Irish Republic, and also in the Netherlands. And one of the issues I would also be looking into will be how the use of sustainable methods of commuting varies between genders and ethnic groups. And then in conclusion, drawing it all together and saying, well, what does this mean for policymakers? So if we move on to the first slide, please. So during COVID and ever since COVID, the Office of National Statistics has undertaken a regular survey asking people where they've been working. And for the last 2 years that the figures have been relatively stable, we've reached a new sort of status quo as to where we are. So there are around 30 million people in the UK who are in work. And of those, around 13 million are in employment where they are unable to work from home. They regularly travel to and from their workplace. The rest can either work from home or they can work in a particular workplace. So we get at the bottom of that slide around 4 million people who work permanently from home. At the top of the slide, we get around 1.5 million people who are able to work from home, but still go into their workplace. And then we see the sort of the bulk of people who can work at home some of the time and go to their workplace some of the time. And you see there some minor sort of gender variations. So more men than women say they're not able to work from home, while more women than men say they have worked from home for some of the time during the previous week. As I say, this is a snapshot from a month or so ago, but that situation has been sort of relatively stable now for quite a while. So what we've seen is a major change from that situation where everybody used to go to work all the time to a situation where people are now commuting for part of the working week, and part of the working week they're staying at home and working. Next slide, please. And what we see is quite large variations by age as to where people are working. So the under 30s say 60% of those say they are unable to work from home. They have to go to their workplace. That number falls quite dramatically for those between 30 and 49. These are people who may be in more senior positions, maybe have caring responsibilities, maybe looking for more flexibility as to where they want to work. So there are variations, as I say, as people get older in terms of where they're working. Are they able to work from home? Do they want to work from home? And this has sort of implications if you're trying to change people's attitudes and policies. So as we can see, it's many young people who are going into their workplaces every day. They're the ones that potentially, if you can change their travel habits, you're having a major impact long term as they keep those commuting patterns over time. Next slide, please. So obviously that has implications, all this working from home, in the number of trips that people are making for commuting purposes. And looking back over the last 20 years, what we've seen is the number of trips, commuting trips paid by people has fallen by around a third in most cases for full-time employees. Sorry, for full-time employees. The number of people who are now commuting trips they make in a year is now just about 2/3 of what they were doing back in 2004. A slightly lesser fall for those in part-time employment, and that's generally because those individuals are working in occupations where it's more difficult to work from home. Part-time jobs are more common in areas like hospitality and retail. So what you're seeing there is a slightly smaller fall in the number of commuting trips made by those part-time workers. If you look at the total distance traveled, that has not fallen as much as the number of trips has fallen. And to the right of the slide, you can see average trip distances. And what we're seeing there is for those in full-time employment, their average trip distance hasn't changed much since 2004. Their commuting journeys are roughly the same length. But for those in part-time employment and those who are self-employed, we've seen some quite substantial increases in trip lengths. And one of the issues that arose during COVID, and as a question that's often been asked, is are people living further away from their workplaces? And there's some evidence that that is the case, that people are actually moving further away because they're not having to travel into their workplace every day. And therefore, they make a trade-off between when they do have to go into the office or their workplace, they're prepared to spend a bit longer because they're not doing it so often. Next slide, please. I think we always have to remember that actually most commuting trips are still made by car. So again, back in 2004, the average commuter in full-time employment was making around 220 trips a year by car. And that has fallen by 2023 to less than 150. So we've seen a big reduction in the number of commuting trips made by all modes of transport. But as you can see from that chart, car use dominates the commuting world. Some interesting exceptions in walking. People are more likely to walk if they're in part-time employment than if they're in full-time employment. And what we've seen is some smaller changes for things like rail between 2004 and 2023. There hasn't been much change in the number of average commuting trips by that mode. So what we've seen is a big fall in the number of commuting trips being made, but as I say, car still dominates the picture. Move on to the next slide, please. And that's even more the case when you look at the miles that people travel commuting. So that completely dominates the picture. If you look at the average distance people travel by different modes for commuting purposes, for walking, it's less than a mile. For cycling, it's about 3 miles. For cars, it's around 10 miles. And then because you've got the highest proportion drive and they're driving longer distances, then it completely dominates the terms of miles done for commuting. Rail tends to be quite long distances commuting, around 20 miles for the average rail commute. So rail is also sort of appears on that chart. But as you can see, for walking and cycling, the amount of miles done for the average commuter is very small indeed compared to the other modes of transport. Next slide, please. If we look at how commuting trips by mode have changed from 2004 to 2023, you'll see in all cases except rail, they've declined across all employment types. So again, we're seeing around a third of number of commuting trips by most modes has fallen since 2004. The exceptions have been in sort of part-time employment, again, for the reasons said before, that they are jobs that people are less likely to be able to do from home. And rail stands out as an area that's lost fewer trips. And that's because rail use increased quite considerably in the early 2000s. So although rail use has fallen since the pandemic, it's still at a reasonable level back compared if you go back to 2004. The next slide, please. And again, the same sort of picture comes from distances. And the key point here is on cycling. So what we've seen actually, the amount of distance traveled by cyclists has increased quite a bit for both part-time and those in full-time employment. But I think we have to remember the average distance traveled is actually only increased from just under 3 miles to just over 3 miles. So it's a case of not getting too excited, but we are seeing some of these average journey lengths, the average miles traveled by these various modes increasing slightly. Next slide, please. And again, if we look at the average distance traveled per commuting trip by mode, not surprising, there's been no change in walking. People are only sort of prepared to walk for about a mile. Cycling, as I said, has increased slightly. Driving, again, has increased slightly. And rail use for self-employed people has increased quite a bit. So some indications that people are living slightly further away from where they work. And that has implications because people are only prepared to travel by sustainable modes for relatively short distances. We're talking about walking and cycling. So as I said, walking, people tend to be prepared to walk for about a mile. Cycling, people are prepared to sort of cycle on average for about 3 miles. And if you're moving further away from where your place of work, then those sort of modes of transport sometimes become less attractive to people. Next slide, please. And this sort of shows you the average time people are prepared to take commuting. So what we see for most cases, walking, the green bar there, people are prepared to walk for about 15 minutes, which sort of equates to that mile distance that they're prepared to travel. For cycling, distances, again, as I say, about 3 miles, something you can do in about 20 minutes. That's the sort of average time that people are prepared to spend. In London, we see slightly higher figures for both walking and cycling. But in most cases, the amount of time people are prepared to spend commuting is between that sort of 20 to 30-minute time scale. The big difference here is rail. People spend a lot longer commuting by rail. They've got to get to the railway station. They tend to take the train. They've got to walk at the other end. And so the average commuting times for rail are a lot longer, but also they're traveling on average quite a lot further as well. The average rail commute is about 20 miles, as I said, compared to the average car commute, which is about 10 miles. The next slide, please. So in the UK, we have a census every 10 years. You might not appreciate that we actually have 3 censuses in the UK. So England and Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland all have their own censuses, all asking slightly different questions, which makes comparisons slightly difficult. And they also have different ways of cross-tabbing data. And so in Northern Ireland, they don't collect data on cycling to work, but they do collect data on walking to work, and they collect data on car availability. So you can do cross tabs between the two. And it's no surprise for households where there are no cars or vans available, then around a third of people are walking to work. That percentage drops off quite dramatically when you go down to just one car, and with 2 cars, you're down to under 5%. So we need to be careful that correlation doesn't mean causation, and people in 2-car households may be living in more rural areas. They may be living in less dense areas where they're further away from their place of employment. But very clearly, as you remove cars, then you have more opportunities to persuade people to walk, or they have to walk to work. Next slide, please. Across the border in the Irish Republic, they do their censuses on a different basis. They do censuses every 5 years. And again, for them, as in Scotland, they delayed their 2021 census to 2022. And what we see here is the proportion of people who cycle and walk to work are broken down by females and males. Back in 1981, around a quarter of women working in the Irish Republic walked to work, and that number rapidly declined. The big change that has occurred in Ireland is the proportion of women in work, which has increased dramatically since 1981. And so, although there are proportionate fewer people walking to work now, in absolute terms, there are actually more women walking to work than there were in 1981 because of a huge increase in women in the workforce. But what we've seen here is a gradual decline for women in walking to work. In cycling, a gradual decline to about 2006, and then a sort of steady increase, which has continued up to 2022. For males, again, a sort of similar picture, steady decline in the number of people walking to work. And again, in cycling, we saw a slight uptick again in sort of 2002, 2006, but the percentages are still extremely small. We then see this uptick in 2022 with a big increase in walking to work, especially. And in part, again, this is skewed by the fact that this was in the sort of tail end of COVID. A lot of people were still working from home. Those people who had jobs where you had to be at your workplace, such as hospitality, such as retail, are people who are more likely to be walking anyway. So the figures are a bit skewed by that, and one shouldn't get too excited. There's suddenly been a massive uptick in walking to work in Ireland, but certainly we've seen a slight uptick in cycling, but this sort of steady decline in walking. Next slide, please. One of the interesting things when you look at the data is that there is no correlation between walking and cycling. So those sectors where lots of people walk to work, very relatively few people cycle to work, and vice versa, which is in some ways a reflection of both gender differences and sort of socioeconomic status. So the sectors where you have a high proportion of people walking to work, those ones at above sort of 20%, a lot of those are in sort of retail and hospitality type sectors where people often work very close to where they live. And so you've got over 20% of people there walking to work, but less than 4% of people are actually cycling to work in those sectors. And you see it again on the sector which has the highest cycling proportion, almost 10% of workers in this sector cycling to work, is actually in sort of research and development type activities. But then once you realize that most of those jobs are heavily skewed towards Cambridge and Oxford, which has a culture of cycling, you need to be a bit careful about the conclusions you draw. But it's quite interesting that, as I say, there's sort of no correlation between the cycling and walking sectors, which would encourage lots of people to, or achieve lots of people cycling, don't necessarily achieve lots of people walking, and vice versa. Can you move on to the next slide, please? And if you look at that at an individual occupation level, again, the same picture arises. So again, you've got sectors where, or occupations where a third of people are walking to work, but less than 5% are cycling. And in the other extreme, you've got sectors where 25% of people are cycling into work, but only about 10% of people are walking into work. And so we sort of have policy implications. When you're sort of targeting measures to achieve sustainable commuting, measures that encourage cycling may impact different sectors and different occupations than measures which impact on walking or achieve improved walking to work. Next slide, please. And this sort of comes out on this chart, which shows cycling patterns. It's in case from London, Camden cycle counters. And what we see here is exactly the same picture you see on London Undergrounds and on the National Rail Network. What we see is the highest level of travel by bike is in the morning peak on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. We see a slight reduction in the morning peak on a Monday and a much lower level on a Friday. And this reflects the working practices of those in office-based employment in London, where, again, exactly the same pattern occurs on the Underground and National Rail Network. People are coming into work on those Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. They're working from home on Mondays and definitely working from home from Fridays. And so it gives you an indication that the people who are cycling into work are those who are in sort of office type based jobs. They're not in the sort of retail and hospitality jobs where people are coming into work every day of the week. And again, this will have sort of policy implications as to who are actually benefiting from interventions to improve cycling, or who's benefiting from interventions to improve walking. Next slide, please. And then the obvious challenge on cycling especially is the seasonality. So what we can see here is that the number of people cycling steadily increases from the start of the year in the sort of low points in January, steadily increases towards the springtime, peaks in the early summer. Then you've got a slight decline due to summer holidays, and again, a massive fall off as you get into December. And again, from the working times, there are more people traveling by bike at sort of 8 o'clock in the morning than there are 7 o'clock in the morning, which is again is an indication of the sort of occupations that people are traveling to. Those who are traveling at 7 o'clock are going to things like construction sites. They're less likely to be cycling than people going into office locations. So that seasonality is a major challenge, especially when you're trying to encourage more people to cycle. Next slide, please. Lots of people talk about the Netherlands as the great place where everybody cycles to work and people cycle over time. And this chart shows that the proportion of commuting trips by mode in comparing England and the Netherlands using both countries' travel surveys, national travel surveys, shows that in the Netherlands, almost 30% of people cycle to work. Back in England, it's down at less than sort of 5%. But then if you look at the proportion of people commuting by car as a driver, there isn't that much difference between England and the Netherlands. And what you see is actually in the Netherlands, fewer people walk and fewer people use local public transport, i.e. the bus or tram or metro systems. And if you go on to the next slide, please. That is even more clear when you look at the distance travelled by mode in the England and Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, actually, the higher proportion of commuting miles are done by car, van in England. And what we see, obviously, as sort of highlighted before, most bicycle trips are relatively short. In the Netherlands, people are transferring to bicycles principally from walking and from the sort of slower forms of public transport, from bus and tram. They're not transferring from car. So often these ideas that if you increase sustainable travel options to people, you're going to get people out of cars, often doesn't really work. What you're doing is you're getting people off public transport. And you see that in places like central London, where there's a massive increase in cycling to work. Those people previously weren't driving into central London because there were no places to park. They would have been on the underground network or the bus network. So what we're doing by improving cycling, which is great, but you're not getting people out of cars by improving cycling. And that's something to sort of bear in mind. If you want to try and reduce car use and get people to use other forms of sustainable travel, then there are other measures that you need to take into account. Next slide, please. So I'm sure all of you here have read Invisible Women. So a great publication which sort of highlights the data gaps that exist when often data is collected either just for men or is not disaggregated between the two genders. And we end up with lots of policy decisions which are actually based on males' behaviors and activities rather than actually looking at how men and women use the transport system differently. If as a woman you feel you're invisible, then if you are a person of color or from an ethnic minority, then you just don't exist on the system. We collect very little data at a disaggregated ethnic breakdown. So the QR code on your screen gives you access to a much more detailed paper, which looks at a whole range of issues to do with transport, commuting by gender and ethnicity. And I'm just here going to show a few slides from that paper. So the 2021 census for England and Wales is one of the few data sources which allows us to look at ethnicity in a quite detailed level. And it's worth highlighting when we talk about ethnicity, there were three factors which statisticians thought didn't change about a person. One is their date of birth, one is their gender, and one is their ethnicity. Anybody who's tried to trace their family history or family tree will know actually dates of birth change all the time. But what people claim as their date of birth on official documents changes quite surprisingly often. In terms of gender, we won't get into that discussion, but we all know various issues about gender. On an ethnicity, if you look at me and you listen to me, you think, well, he's obviously white British. But actually, if you look at my surname, it's not a British surname. I actually have more Irish blood in me than British blood, although my surname is obviously not Irish, and it's from continental Europe. So there are lots of people like me who come from mixed backgrounds, and depending on how I feel on the day, I would fill in a form as either being white British, white Irish, or other white, just to confuse people. And so statisticians have found that how people self-report their ethnicity varies quite considerably over time. So bearing that in mind, as we sort of look at some of these slides, but I think it gives you a very useful snapshot of some of these differences between how people from different ethnicities and genders travel. We know that people's choice of transport is heavily influenced by their earnings. We don't have data on earnings. The census gives us a proxy in terms of qualifications. So this analysis looks at people with level 4 qualifications, that's degree level and above, based in northwest of England, and how they commute to work. And it looks at the differences between men and women by ethnicity and their propensity to bus, cycle, or walk to work. And what the chart shows is the percentage point difference between the genders by ethnicity. So if you look at the left-hand side, for Bangladeshi women, they are 3 percentage points more likely to travel to work by bus or to walk than Bangladeshi males. They are slightly less likely to cycle to work than their male counterparts. And what we can see across all ethnicities is that women are more likely to use the bus and to walk than males, while males are more likely to cycle than women. and that applies across all ethnicities. So looking at the sort of northwest of England, because we're trying not to be so London-centric, but the problem is that the northwest covers major cities such as Manchester and Liverpool, but then also covers more rural areas such as Cumbria. So the next slide, please. So London is the obvious place to look. It has the most diverse population. It has the highest level of public transport and active travel, commuting, lowest level of car use. And so again, looking at what the differences are between men and women traveling to work, again, with level 4 qualifications, those with degree level qualifications. And so on the right-hand side, what we have here is the proportion of women who cycle to work. So if you look at the top one, so 2% of Arab women in London with level 4 qualifications cycle to work in the 2021 census. And then on the left-hand side, you do see the percentage point difference between males from those ethnicities. So again, from the top one, Arab men are 3 percentage points more likely to cycle than Arab women. So 2% of Arab women and 5% of Arab men cycle to work. And again, so we see that across all ethnicities, that there's a higher proportion of men than women cycling to work. And you also see the differences between the ethnicities themselves. So certain ethnicities have relatively high levels of cycling to work, other ethnicities have very low levels of cycling to work. So again, the sort of how do you address these sort of issues when you're making policy decisions? Moving on to the next slide, please. And again, what we see here is on walking to work. So again, the green bars show the proportion of women by each ethnicity who walk to work. So the top there is sort of white Irish, for example. White Irish women, 16% of them walk to work. That drops down to only about 7% for Black African women who walk to work. And the sort of yellow bars or orangey bars are the percentage points difference between women and men. So in all cases, there are more women than men walking to work. And again, you can see the percentage points difference vary from sort of for white to Roma, it's sort of 6%, for Bangladeshi it's 6%, down to sort of the more mixed race areas where it's off down, the gaps are only about 2 percentage points. So what we see again is that more women than men across all ethnicities are walking to work. And again, these are sort of policy implications about when you do interventions and policy interventions. Taking these into account is important. Moving on to the next slide. So what does it all mean? So some conclusions and sort of policy implications here. So obviously we've seen this massive decrease in commuting, but we've also seen a slightly increase in the length that people are prepared to commute. And that has implications for trying to persuade people to switch modes or forcing people to switch modes. People aren't necessarily going to cycle 15, 20 miles if they've moved out of major cities as a result of COVID. What we've seen is that younger people are more likely to be regular commuters. And again, that has policy implications. If you can persuade people at a younger age to change their commuting habits, then they may stick with those habits for the rest of their commuting career. We see average walk and cycle commute times are relatively low. So again, that influences what proportion of people you can persuade to switch modes or to walking and cycling. People are less likely to walk long distances. I'm a rarity. I walk to work every day and I walk just over 2 miles, but I'm obviously the exception. Car availability. So again, correlation doesn't equal causation, but fairly obviously, if you remove cars from households, people are more likely to walk. There's no correlation between walking and cycling. Often we lump in together sustainable travel modes and interventions, but actually the needs of walkers and cyclists are different. The types of people who walk and cycle are different, and that sort of needs to be addressed, sort of gender differences there. How do we address seasonality? We are never going to change the extremes between summer and winter in terms of weather, but how do we make cycling and walking more attractive in the winter and autumn? And just to pick a point really from the stories, from one of the stories from Invisible Women, was that in Sweden, when snow fell, what they did was clear the roads first, and then if you're lucky, they would clear the walkways. And they were finding a higher proportion of women were ending up in accident and emergency due to falls. And the reason for that, as we've seen, is that women are more likely to walk than men. And so one local area changed their policy. They've cleared the pavements first before the roads, and saw a decrease in the number of women coming in with broken arms and legs and whatever as a result of falls. So addressing the sort of issue of seasonality is important. And again, the sort of key point here probably is the Dutch evidence, which suggests that if you increase bicycle use, you're probably going to end up with reducing walking and public transport use unless you start actually enforcing people to change by restricting use of cars. And the biggest way of doing that is removing parking. So we've seen massive changes, for example, in Paris, where they've taken out large number of car parking spaces, and as a result, we've seen a huge increase in cycling. So that was my conclusions from the end of the presentation. If you want to move on to the next slide. For those of you who are into data, you can follow me on LinkedIn. That QR code will give you the access to follow me or connect to me on LinkedIn, and you can see sort of regular postings on data across all modes of transport. Thank you very much.